My favorite wrestling author of all time is the poetic stylings of one leaping Lanny Poffo.
Boom. What did he write?
One of the greatest American poets of all time.
He used to read poetry in the ring. He made it happen. Are you kidding me?
Oh, no, wrestlers can't write. There's nothing of...
What's that say?
Bun.
No.
Audrey Hepburn.
That guy's a UFC fighter.
Oh, CM Punk. Yeah, he's not a wrestler.
Yeah.
Chicago's very own.
There's so much wrestling in comics. It's shocking how tied the two industries are together.
Very separate. Very separate. You're wrong in your premise. I'm saying they're very separate.
He's absolutely right in his premise. Comics started emulating wrestling. Superman is wearing a wrestler's unitard and tunic.
If you go to
That's
Mexico, absolutely, all their wrestlers are pretty much living superheroes, and then they have their own comics and so on and so
I
forth.
completely agree with you. Wrestlers steal from comics all the time.
No.
You're talking Rey Mysterio Jr. was Joker at a pay-per-view.
Yeah.
He was Silver Surfer. He was Captain America.
Who's the guy that used to dress like the Crow?
Sting, James
Sting.
Bond.
The
Crow, yeah,
There's a
absolutely.
long history of comic books being a central point with which wrestling has stolen.
Wrestling has never stolen from comics. Oh wait, Hulk Hogan. Do you know why he's called Hulk Hogan? Really?
Because of the Incredible Hulk, who predated Hulk Hogan's existence. Who was the wrestler that Spider-Man fought in the early days?
Crusher Hogan.
Ooh, Hogan! Hogan is ready!
Oh yeah!
No, but that's what I'm saying. So
You just crossed over Hogan and Macho Man. That's like
They're the same.
But they're
guy.
the same guy, brother.
They are
The Mega
They are
Powers.
the Mega Powers.
The Mega Powers.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah, they were great.
So they
were real life superheroes. is
They
what you're
stole
saying.
the idea of superhero combining from World's Finest, which predates the Mega Powers.
So wrestling
I
and
am
comics have a long history.
back on the side of wrestling steals from comics.
I don't think it's a matter of stealing. I think it's a matter of celebrating.
So I mean, we've kind of talked about this, like what is derivative and what is inspired by something, and there, especially today, some of the best wrestlers out there were inspired by superheroes. Look at the Hurricane. He was a modern day superhero that you saw in real life, and yes, Pablo,
Yeah.
he would do
He did that thing.
He dabbed?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah,
You dabbed
he
before
did,
dabbing was
yeah.
dabbing,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But then also look at the next upcoming generation of wrestlers. Finn Balor, he's painted to be like Venom and Carnage. It's not stealing, it's celebrating because the two are just linked together. I mean, going back to Punk, when CM Punk had the Money in the Bank briefcase, what do you think was in there? It wasn't a contract for his title match. It was actually his weekly comic books. That's how he traveled with them.
What a nerd.
Right?
That's awesome.
There's been a lot of great comics based on pro wrestlers, like, I guess The Undertaker's book, if you remember. I mean, he was a wrestler crossing into comics.
Let's not go too far. You were great.
But hey,
Let's keep a
there's a
little integrity
nostalgia
here.
value to it. There's a nostalgia value. It may have not been great. I mean, like now as we read it, but as a kid, it was amazing. I was like, The Undertaker is this living comic book character.
China had a comic book. I mean,
I'm all for celebrating, but we have yet to see a great wrestling comic book.
I mean, the
let's-
Marvel
let's be
WCW line was pretty great.
Yeah,
I would
the
say we
Dangerous
haven't
Alliance.
seen a great WWE-based comic book, but there have been some good wrestling comic books. Look at when Raven, who was a wrestler, he was in ECW, WCW, WWE, and he wrote one of the Untold Tales of Spider-Man, and it was all about Crusher Hogan.
Oh, nice.
And what happened to this guy's career when he got beat by this little punk kid. And it was like a really emotional book that you wouldn't have expected as a one-off issue, and it was fantastic. And it's not just Raven, like other wrestlers are getting involved in the creation of comic books too. Look at the indie book Headlocked. It's a story of coming up through the independent wrestling circuit, but so much of the material has been provided by wrestlers. You have people like Christopher Daniels, you have people like Sin Bodhi, Hurricane Helms. All these guys have contributed to a wrestling comic book, and that's why more wrestlers like that comic book than anything else, because it feels true to what they've gone through.
And there's two really good biographies about Andre the Giant, actually, in graphic novel form.
And why haven't they been on my poll list? You're the
They
worst
are
comic book store
amazing.
clerk ever.
There also was a
Roddy Piper.
Roddy Piper Monster Hunter book that
And
just
why
came
didn't you
out.
put that in my poll list?
I own that.
You
Yeah, the Roddy
suck.
Piper Monster Hunter.
It's actually a lot of
Is it
fun.
great?
It
Yeah.
actually is a lot of fun.
Also, what about Christopher Daniels and Kazarian being in that Art Baltazar Oh Yeah comics?
Oh yeah, they were in it and they helped create the damn thing.
Absolutely.
I think that there's a nexus point in comics and wrestling that kind of happens around the idea of Spider-Man's origins. So Crusher Hogan predates Hulk Hogan and his thing. But when you get to modern times, Hulk Hogan becomes a very predominant wrestler. Then you get into the Spider-Man movies, and you have Macho Man Randy Savage playing Bonesaw, who is always Randy. And that character...
Maybe that's why they didn't use the name Crusher Hogan, because it was Macho Man playing him at that point.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Crusher Man Randy Savage didn't really work as well as Bonesaw.
Yeah.
But the point is, where comic books and wrestling have had the deepest intersection, despite the fact that CM Punk is writing a Batista comic book, essentially, that Drax in Guardians of the Galaxy represents sort of a staging out point from where comics and wrestling truly meet, and that's on the silver screen. If you look at the wrestling comic groups, where their Venn diagram meets more than anything else is movies. You go all the way back to the worst thing ever to have Batman's name on it, Batman and Robin. There was the only thing in that movie that made sense from a comic book basis was venomized Bane, who was...
Jeep Swenson.
Yes, a wrestler.
Only
And
you would
There he
know
was.
that.
I know.
You would know
I
that.
am the worst.
You seem like the one guy that would.
It's very true. Tyler Mane played Sabretooth.
Tyler Mane played Sabretooth. You have Triple H in Blade Trinity.
Darko Grimwood.
Oh,
You
gosh.
seem to have read that
Triple
from
H.
some sort of tablet.
No.
Yeah,
In Blade Trinity,
they
he
had
had
the
a
vampire Pomeranian.
He had
Yeah.
the silver fangs and a adorable
did,
little
and the Pomeranian.
Pomeranian.
And then he beat up the guy who would go on to play Deadpool.
And he beat up Deadpool. Kevin Nash, not only was he the Super Shredder, he was also the Russian in The Punisher.
Which was a terrible film.
What about Stephen Amell, the Arrow, who is now
Yes.
involved in the WWE?
That's true. At SummerSlam this past year, he fought Stardust, who arguably looks like he's a supervillain.
So you bring in a lot of the comic book influence. Even if you look at that match, it was all about like the Arrow and Neville is a superhero, flying. And then Stardust and whoever Stardust's tag team partner was.
You're gonna see when The Rock plays Black Adam in Shazam.
Ooh, and I think that might be the pièce de résistance of wrestler and comic book, because that is right now one of the biggest movie stars on the land, The Rock, who was a wrestler. His charisma has carried him beyond everything and anything, and he has embraced and loves the roots of wrestling, and he brings that up.
Yeah.
He's blazed a trail for Batista and Drax.
He's an action
and all that stuff. But when The Rock takes on the comic book role, his first major comic book role, roadblock aside, as Black Adam, like that's going to be a point where you have a true movie star who started in the wrestling world, who went all the way to stardom and then into the comic book space, which I think is going to bring him to the stratosphere of characters, because he has the look and physique of a wrestler, which is all the comic movies always try to get. They love a wrestler is a human comic book character, at least in physique.
He's going from being one of the biggest heroes when he left his time in wrestling. I mean, he was the top, all the way up there.
Number one,
to being a massive villain. So it's the transition. It's the world of wrestling all over again, but in comic form, because good guys always switch back and forth, and The Rock gets to do it.
So what you're saying is, when The Rock is Black Adam, that's the most prominent heel turn in the
Ever.
history of time.
Yep. And on that note, can I buy this fucking book? I didn't want to stay here for 20 minutes tonight. Fuck you guys.
$13.
It's signed by AJ Lee.
Who?